So today I wanted to make a video on weighing the importance of achieving social milestones, notably young love, along with sharing my lack of experience and the impact it's had on me. And I feel like it's an appropriate time to make this video in my life because I've reached this weird age range of my early 20s where it's still possible to develop socially, but the majority of the work needed to be done when I was a teenager. Along with the fact that life is much more guided and structured for you back then, so naturally, you're going to get more opportunities for socializing. And just to clarify, when talking about social milestones, I'm going to be mainly referring to things that happen during your teenage years, though I'm not trying to downplay the importance of socializing when you're still a child. But excluding extreme events of trauma, isolation, or if you're neurodivergent, I'd say it's still too early in life to make definitive judgments on people's social skills. Barring those edge cases I mentioned, I'm going to be kind of doubtful towards people who claim that their social life was ruined because they had a negative experience in elementary school. But that point aside, in my case, I lucked out socially. I had a group of friends I made in elementary school, and I never moved either, so they stayed with me up until my high school graduation. Not saying I was super close with them early on. Actually, most of the time we spent was later on in high school, and back then I was much more content. If you were to bring up the concept of not achieving conventional social milestones, like going to parties, getting into a relationship, or losing my virginity, I wouldn't have cared too much. And if you were to ask me today if I had any of those traditional teenage experiences, I'd express a similar level of indifference, or depending on the person, I would just lie and say they happened. But what changed internally was I no longer had the same optimism for my future. For two main reasons. The first being the progression into adulthood. As you get older, it's hard to make time for others, and people just naturally drift apart. Secondly, I still had all of college to continue to figure things out. There was that reassurance that I had a few more years in a relatively similar environment. With those two factors in mind, it's hard not to feel a sense of regret and hopelessness towards improving socially. And I think a common sentiment for some people in a similar situation as me, but maybe older, is to just tell me that's just the way of the world. Life is lonely as an adult and you have to get used to it. But I feel like the people who identify with that statement have either just gotten unlucky in their adult social life or are like me and have never really bothered to develop the social skills necessary to succeed past college. And here's where I want to make the distinction between having a social life and social skills, because it explains a lot about where I went wrong, even though everything appeared fine on the surface. To give an example from my experience, I was around confident and well spoken people most of my life, and I'd even consider some of them my friends. But it's not like I was absorbing their social skills they developed by just being in their presence, because that actually involves participating in the conversation, or God forbid, talking to people I don't know. And I don't mean to sound ungrateful. Obviously, given the choice between having friends or being alone, you'd be crazy not to take the former. At the same time, though, I was definitely getting complacent about my social life, which explains a lot as to why I never took any initiative when it came to personal goals, with the most prominent one being trying to get a girlfriend. On the other hand, social skills are gained by being in a variety of conversations, and while it's possible to learn them by listening to other people talk, you're going to learn much faster by being a direct participant. The bottom line for me is I did have a social life, but I was never motivated enough to go out and try to talk to people I didn't know. Even among friends, I was never too talkative. And how that relates to missing out on young love was even then, I understood if I wanted to be in a relationship, I would have to be the one to initiate and maintain most conversations with women, but of course, I never had the confidence to try. This goes for all ages, but I feel that as a man, you have to put in way more effort up front when it comes to dating, and whatever you can't bring in the form of looks, you have to make up for socially with things like status or your ability to communicate well. That does sound pretty shallow, but I'm not referring to relationships holistically, just the initial stages of attraction, which unfortunately do come down to first impressions and superficial information a lot of the time. I know I'm the furthest thing from an expert, but it's hard not to feel a little cynical about dating when you've gone your whole life without being in a relationship, regardless of whose fault it is. But going back to social life versus social skills, upon graduating high school, I felt content but a bit regretful that I missed out on getting a girlfriend, though I hadn't completely given up hope because even though I was technically an adult now, I still had plenty of time and was starting fresh in a new environment through college. Plus, I didn't have to adhere to any expectations or impressions of how I acted when I was in high school, which, if you haven't gotten the impression already, I was a very quiet and awkward kid. But to sum up my experience, I just fumbled the bag for 4 straight years. Actually, that's not too accurate. I didn't even have the bag. It was like I was watching it from a distance and didn't even try to get it one time. It was that pathetic. Like, things were getting so bad for me socially, I gave up on trying to get a girlfriend. At that point, I just wanted somebody to hang out with once in a while. And I could give a bunch of different excuses regarding my environment, but I knew it was still possible to make friends. Otherwise, why was everyone else but me able to have a social life? I just had no idea how to approach people. Even in the rare moments where I managed to have a conversation, it usually led nowhere. That's not to say people hated me. I just realized I was an uninteresting person who couldn't hold a conversation. So objectively, I understand why I struggled so much socially. Beyond having friends or getting into relationships, social skills are the main thing that will help you get a job in today's market. Even in fields that are highly specialized and supposed to be decided on skill, you can't really get anywhere unless you know somebody. And by knowing somebody, I'm referring to being likable and interesting enough in conversation that they're willing to vouch for you. What I'm trying to get at is if you don't have the necessary social skills, you're going to suffer in most areas of life because once you become an adult, it's mainly up to you to be responsible for your success. And in my case, because of my lack of social skills, I ended off with having no meaningful relationships either professionally or personally, meaning I'm entering the rest of my adulthood without any experience in setting myself up for any kind of career or social life. Seriously, where do I even start at my age and situation? I'm living with my parents, and everybody that I went to school with has moved on. Even the people who don't have jobs yet, who just spent college messing around and partying, have healthy social lives now, and at least get to enjoy what's left of their youth. Meanwhile, I'm making mediocre commentary on where my life went wrong and realizing that I should have tried to socialize more 6 years ago. I just think my reasoning the past couple years was that I'd given up on trying to find a friend group or girlfriend, so I'll just work hard in school, follow the conventional advice given to you by parents. But that turned out to be a waste of time because nowadays, if you're evaluated by anything, it's your social aptitude, not by any metrics of understanding or retaining information. And it's not like anybody explicitly told me this throughout my life. The closest thing I'd get is my parents telling me to go outside. Though to be fair, it is much harder to instill as a goal within children because it's not something that can be quantified in the same way as schoolwork, athletics, or other tangible metrics of early success. But speaking of measuring success, I want to circle back to the whole idea of social milestones because that's been viewed as a general indicator of whether someone is socially competent or not. And I believe you can't make the same argument for their usefulness, at least regarding the more traditional milestones. As I mentioned earlier, trying to compare others when using these cliched social milestones of going to parties, doing drugs, or drinking, it didn't have much meaning to me. I definitely was aware of people doing that stuff when I was a teen, but even then I understood those experiences were becoming less popular. I think they're much more representative of life as a millennial growing up in the 90s and 2000s, before the internet became so widespread. What I'm saying is, if you're my age or younger, you shouldn't be so hung up about not achieving those social milestones. A lot of them are superficial and won't give you any life skills. However, what should be concerning is not socializing at all. If you're not putting any effort into social skills early on, it becomes easier to put off because you convince yourself it's just not something that comes naturally to you. I realize I'm not very qualified to be giving out advice given my circumstances, but this is my interpretation of why my life ended up the way it did. Sorry if what I said contradicted the title and thumbnail, but I didn't want this video to be me crying over why my life was ruined because I didn't get a girlfriend and have sex when I was 16, because I know how easy it is to romanticize these experiences, especially if they never even happened to you. Though I can definitely understand why people might think that that was the subject of the video because the thumbnail and title are complete doom or slop. Yeah, but seriously, life does suck when you never get over your nature as a shy and awkward kid. It is fixable, but taking responsibility for that has to be done early, and that's hard to realize when you think you have infinite time to work on it. I just think it's pointless to be mourning experiences that never even happened, and in my case, never attempted. I also know that the video might be considered a bit rage bait, because on paper I still have a lot of time left. I definitely think this video would have been a lot more impactful and insightful if somebody in their 30s or 40s was talking about this, just based on the longer amount of life experience they have. However, like I mentioned, I've reached the very end of my prolonged adolescence now that I'm out of college, so I can say with a fair degree of confidence that the rest of my 20s probably aren't going to be that much different based on my current lifestyle. I'm just saying random stuff at this point in the video, so I hope you got something out of this despite me contradicting myself the entire time. Okay, bye.